The First Book of Christ for Atheists, Chapter 35, Plan Ahead. This book is available free of charge on YouTube, Facebook, Spotify, Instagram, or you can buy it for $20 on Amazon. I had just finished a hike with my son and realized that there were certain activities that I should no longer participate in, one being 6-day hikes into the wilderness. I wrote about it, the West Coast Trail. This hike was more than a challenge, the beginning of a great adventure. It was on my 68th birthday, and Carol and I traveled to Kelowna prepared for a fun time, her to spend time with daughter-in-law Brenda and the grandkids Matea and Liam on their first days of the new school year, and Ryan and I venturing onto the West Coast Trail for a bit of time to spend by ourselves as father and son. The suggestion of the hike was initiated by my 42-year-old number one son, and the thought of having alone time with him was enough of a motivator to convince me that it would be a great experience. The trail itself was built to save shipwrecked sailors from perishing. The coastline was so rugged that it developed the reputation of being the graveyard of the Pacific. More than 30 ships were lost in this 75-kilometer stretch of coastline. Many of the hazards were a result of neglect of the trail. Beauty could be measured by the severe ruggedness of the environment. I knew that the trek would be difficult, but I felt confident that I was in good enough condition to do it. Breaking in new boots with a few 1-hour hikes in St. Albert and Edmonton, as well as a 5.5-hour hike on the Edmonton trails in the River Valley, convinced me that my feet would be good if I kept my daily hiking to 5 hours or less. According to the Bible of the West Coast Trail, Blisters and Bliss, all hikes appeared to be 3 to 4 hours in longevity, so I was good to go. What I didn't take into account was that the book was written in 1989, and a lot had changed over 30 years, and not for the better. All pictures were caricatures, so you really couldn't get a true feeling of what to expect. With the pictures I included in my book, Parks Canada would not list my book as it portrayed a true but negative view of the West Coast Trail Park. In addition, climbing up and down hills and rocks would put a great deal of pressure on your toes, much like playing squash or downhill skiing. Not anticipating that part of the terrain meant that I didn't put cushion pads and tape in my first aid kit, which could have prevented the severe damage to my feet. Admittedly, having these items in my first aid kit wouldn't have helped me one bit, because I forgot my first aid kit at home. Besides Mountain Equipment Co-op, some of the equipment I needed was bought online, and our backpacks were borrowed from our good friends, John and Judith Brame, Hash members and adventurers extraordinaire. If you don't know what the Hash is, they are a drinking group with a hiking problem. They were formed by the British soldiers during World War II for recreation on their days off. They are found in many countries around the world. With weight being the consideration for a week-long hike, we bought dehydrated food, only 2 pairs of socks and underwear to be washed and exchanged every day while the river-washed clothes were dried on the outside of your backpack. I had rain gear for my motorcycle and a pair of shorts. All clothing was quick-dry synthetic. Boots were waterproof, and the gaiters added a layer of protection from mud and water seeping up into your boots over the top. The tents were light for hiking, and we brought a couple of tarps should we get caught trying to make camp in the rain. While we met Ryan and Brenda for camping in Banff to drop off the kids after enjoying 3 weeks with the grandkids in July, I tried out a sleeping bag that I had used last year on the 75th annual motorcycle rally in Sturgis, South Dakota, joining 500,000 riders to party and ride the historic trails into America's pioneer history. I nearly froze with different cooler temperatures in Banff than in Sturgis and shivered all night. I replaced it with a synthetic mummy sleeping bag, good up to freezing. The mean temperature on the West Coast Trail is around 15 degrees centigrade or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So I felt that I had that covered. With testing done, I felt that I was ready for the challenge and prepared for a time in the forest that could lead to severe repercussions for the ill-prepared. A couple of days before we were leaving, a wasp stung me while I was on my motorcycle. The bite grew inflamed, so as a precaution, I got some antibiotics just in case it didn't settle. It looked uglier than any wasp bite that I'd ever previously had. The nurse and wife, Carol, covered all the bases and made sure that I took every medical pill imaginable in anticipation of what might go wrong. Amoxiclav, allopurinol, Sandoz, Tamsuline, and Tylenol. While I was aware of the dangers of the West Coast Trail, I was most concerned about having a drug overdose. Because my wedding ring was inflamed due to the wasp sting, I took off my ring and gave it to Carol for safekeeping. It was an eerie feeling that might have suggested the predetermined demise of myself. Having lost a friend in a surfing accident a few years back increased my anxiety. I didn't know how I felt giving my ring to my wife, but logic and common sense had to prevail. Not having removed my ring for 45 years, it was a negative premonition that lingered somewhere in the back of my mind until I was able to put it back on at the end of the trail. On September 2nd, Son Ryan and I left for Port Renfrew, not knowing if they would let us on the trail without a booking. When I tried to book, the soonest that they could give me was mid-September, which was too late for both of our schedules. Parks Canada said that they always have room for walk-ins, but you may have to wait 2 days. We got to the registration desk and were almost immediately put into a 1.5 hour orientation for preparation for the trail. Tides, injury, animals, tsunami evacuation, cable car safety, ladder safety, things to look at. At this point, it became clear to me that although this was a federal park, this was not going to be a walk in the park. On Saturday, after 1:30, we took the boat across to kilometer 75 or 47 miles to begin our trek. The first thing we encountered was a 100-foot ladder. What crossed my mind was, what the petunia am I doing here? Our first day was a hike of 5 kilometers or roughly 3 miles to Thrasher's Cove. It was hard by my standards, but the 40-minute hike off the trail down to the water was the most difficult. Our first day included enough time to get our camp properly set up. We shared a fire with other campers. An escorted group of perhaps 7 hikers were very helpful as their guide knew the West Coast Trail like the back of his hand, having been on it 60 times. I asked the guide what was that on the back of his hand. He said it was the map of the trail. There was a young girl in the group who did fish, hunt, canoe, quad, and snowmobile tours in the Yukon. I asked her what she was doing here, and she answered, "Oh, I'm on a holiday." I'm used to holidays where you do something different than what you do all year, but what do I know? We met a couple of kids going the other way that were 12 years old and traveling with their dads who were professional guides. The boy and girl were carrying 10-pound packs and looked in great shape considering that they had been on day 8 of their journey from north to south. One of the dads, named Doc, was instrumental in patching up a middle-aged woman from Holland who had fallen into a campfire on their last night and on our first night and her last night on the trail. So day 2 was Sunday. We saw the Dutch lady in the morning with incredible bandaging that you would only expect from a professional. Doc felt that she had received third-degree burns on the tips of her fingers, but she refused to be evacuated, having only one more day to finish the trail. There were 2 locations on the trail where a boat could get close enough to shore to take somebody out. The rest of the trail relied on a helicopter to take somebody out, and is the reason the parks charge a significant amount to hike the trail. The injured lady's concern was gripping the ladder rungs with her bandaged hands. she had that 100-foot climb out of the end. I asked Doc's partner if they called him Doc because he was a doctor. No, it's because his two older siblings were Hickory and Dickory. Okay, I don't think Dutchie would have had the same confidence in getting him to patch her up had she known why he was called Doc. On Sunday, 5 a.m, Ryan woke me up from slumber with an urgent message that the organized group was breaking camp to get around Owens Point before the tide was above 2.4 meters or almost 8 feet. By 2:22 p.m., the tide would be at 3.3 meters or almost 11 feet. With only 2 kilometers or 1.25 miles to Owens Point, we should have had no problem getting there before noon along the beach, but we didn't want to take any chances, and it was better to follow the lead of experience than to try it on our own and miss the tide. If the tide was up, we would have had to backtrack to the high trail, including a 40-minute hike up to it. It was on this trek that we encountered rocks that we had climbed on and over for several kilometers on our way to our next campsite at Camper Bay. The total trek was 8 kilometers or almost 5 miles, but due to the difficulty of the rocks, I fell 5 times on the rocks and shelf. Shelves were available in low tide and were flat and easy to walk on, easier to walk on than piled up rocks, but at times were extremely treacherous due to the plant and lichen coverings. Someone back in Edmonton had suggested that I study the different rock coverings to become familiar with the ones that were dangerously slippery, but instead I just flew by the seat of my pants many, many times. Due to my backpack weight balance, bad knees, and age, Ryan took my pack from me and walked for 2 hours carrying both packs, while I attempted to cover the rest of the distance without injury. Ryan was now carrying his 40-pound plus pack and my 40-pound pack. Based upon maximum carries, you should carry no more than 1/3 your body weight. Ryan's weight should have been 240 pounds instead of his 210 pounds. I told the folks at camp that Ryan had to carry 80 pounds of pack and drag 185 pounds of burden over the rocks that day. Some of the lichen I walked on were as slippery as ice, and you could slip in an instant. The crashing waves and sand created all kinds of unique designs in the ocean rock. The beach sand varied from sand to gravel. Gravel was deep and was heavy walking. At Camper Bay, Ryan started a fire which he shared with a couple of North American indigenous from Winnipeg heading the other way. I talked to Brave Dee, the Cree, as she was called, because of her reputation of being fearless and determined. She was perhaps in her early 50s and was renting a place this winter up by Big White where Ryan's family skis. Her kids would take care of her Winnipeg home while she was away. She will be on the ski patrol at Big White and stay there for 4 months. Dee was originally from the Swampy Cree Reservation near the Paw, Manitoba, called the Big Eddy. Her people were carbon dated on their land as far back as 4,000 years. Although they had built a shopping mall, seniors mall, hotel, and other things near Big Eddy, Dee felt that her family would have more opportunity in Winnipeg. She said that in 2016, Indigenous represented 4.5% of Winnipeg's population. By 2019, it rose to 12.1%. Of her people, 3,357 still lived on the reservation, and 2,866 had moved off. Opportunity drove many Indigenous to urban centers, and this is why she decided to move her family to Winnipeg. About this time, I was noticing that my toes were pussy and my heels were raw. In addition to the pain, I had to look forward to tomorrow, which was a day of hiking through bog, plus 7 more days on the trail. While I had no intention of quitting, I think that the young lady from Winnipeg could see the emotional strain on my face from doing this trek while going through pain. Dee gave me the inspiration that I needed with her advice. Stepping in the mud, over the boulders, Over the roots is what makes you stronger. Every view of the majestic ocean, the old-growth forests with 300-year-old trees, and the beautiful green meadows is your view of heaven. If you think of that, you will enjoy the trek. Oh, and ignore the pain. I used her inspiration for moving forward for the rest of the trek and was able to gain a great deal of pleasure from our journey by being focused on the good. The early days were delightful, but when my feet started to go, delightful, not so much. In the beginning, we were able to visit with other campers from Europe, USA, Australia, Canada. I chatted with an Irishwoman, Patty O'Toole, that's Gaelic for Smith, who lived in Seattle and was a nurse, adventurer, mountain climber, trekker extraordinaire. She said that she gets the most pleasure when she takes a novice up 2,000 feet on a mountain face and they make it for the first time. She always is in awe of the determination that can conquer the lack of skill, experience, and fear. She was an amazing woman, independent, confident, adventurous, and enthusiastic. She sucked the marrow out of life like very few people I've ever met. I asked her how she copes without a man. She said it's quite simple, actually. Have a profession and be financially independent. Learn to fix and mend. Know who to call if you are unable to fix something, and always carry extra batteries for your percussion tool you always carry in your purse. Bleak, mysterious, and foreboding was the ocean. Day 3, Monday. Once again, the group of 7 were marching off together well before the rest of us were packed. They were going down the beach marked impassable and not taking the upper trail. With them having well-seasoned leader, he knew what we did not, and contemplated going their way when we were ready. However, in about a half an hour, they returned, having discovered that the leader's intention of crossing a surge channel had to be abandoned due to the high water danger. We were warned not to cross surge channels, and at one point had to pull ourselves up onto the side of a rock with a rope, climb onto a path over the river that created the surge channel, and on the beach, and tower ourselves onto the other side. Most surge channels were small enough to jump over, but if you ever got caught in one, they were dangerous and were very difficult to get out of because they can pull you towards the ocean with great force. Yep. A couple from Calgary invited us to join them for the next section of trail, which ended in a camping stop called Walbrun, kilometer 33. David and Colleen hiked with us up to the upper trail towards the bog. At the first climb, I told David I couldn't keep up, so Ryan and I left on our own. These Calgary folks had hiked in the Himalayas, did a safari in Africa, and had traveled extensively around the world. Colleen's family homesteaded near Westlock, north of Edmonton, and her Russian immigrant grandfather subdivided his farm between his 4 children. On one of these farms, Colleen was brought up. Her role in her marriage to David was to divert his attention from his engineering firm and provide exciting adventures to balance their lives. Having spent some time at a campfire with this couple, it was obvious she was doing a great job. They were in their 50s and much more conditioned to hike than myself. Ryan was very patient with my slowness and would go ahead, wait, and take pictures. Many falls and slippery rocks. The question that had to be asked, how's your balance? I bent my pole using it as support. To challenge yourself makes you stronger. Yeah, right. The bog was considered the last of the toughest 3 days on the trail, and from that standpoint, it was not a disappointment. When we first started our journey, we would look for ways to get around mud. By now, we had learned to test the depth of the mud with our poles, find a foot mark to step into, and go as straight as you could through the mud. I had considered not bringing gaiters, which wrap around your legs and are attached to your bootlaces. I thought my boots would be enough on their own, but every day the gaiters proved their worth in keeping my feet free of mud, water, and sand. At one point, I took a step into mud that went up to my knees. Things like this can happen, and the better prepared you are, the less likely it is that you will have to evacuate the trail due to hypothermia or foot damage. The path was not always clean and straight. Sometimes it was dirty and crooked. We arrived at Cape Walbran and had to wash ourselves and our clothing. At this point, I had not washed, and my underwear was starting to chafe my skin. My socks were constantly damp due to the sweat and some outside water seeping in. Nothing would dry in the high humidity, so we used the fire to try to dry a few things. Washing clothes in a river was done below where everyone filled up their water containers. Bathing was done just before the ocean. The water was cold, but nice and refreshing. In our orientation, we were warned how sensitive a bear's nose is detecting food. Ryan was very diligent in putting our food into food lockers available at most campsites. Myself, I smelled like the carcass of a dead wolverine, so if the bear wanted food, do you think that he would notice the scent of a poly-wrapped bonbon or the stench of a dead animal? I slept with my knife and bear spray very close and took my chances. I did find a large patty of vomit near my tent and suspect the bear had walked by my tent and got sick to his stomach due to the smell bellowing from myself. Finding a place to bathe, getting fresh water, clean and dry clothes was not always possible. Day 4, Tuesday. We planned to get to Cribbs Creek, that's kilometer 46, mile 29. This would take us 12 kilometers or 7.5 miles when we had only traveled 22 kilometers or 14 miles in 3 days to this point. We had lots of beach walking because the tides were in our favor, and between rock shelf and gravel sand, we were able to get to an oasis on the trail called Chez Monique. Here we devoured the best $25 hamburger that I had ever tasted. Pop was only $2 as Monique tried to keep the hikers sober. We met up with Dave and Colleen, who were sharing a bottle of wine. I went to the kitchen and asked Monique for a couple of beers. As she was cutting vegetables, she said that she only had 2 hands, and as she turned to face me holding her 4-inch blade knife, she said that in school her teacher told her to put the knife down or she would hurt someone. She threw sodium nitrate in my face. It was assault. I'm not sure what made her so angry, but staying quiet seemed like my best option, and the incident passed. Annoying people is one of my favorite pastimes because I love to watch the different reactions. But in this case, I wasn't even trying. Her French accent and being in her 60s or 90s, it was hard to tell. I would suggest that she had an unusual life, but I wasn't about to delve into it with her. Another group of young people escorted by 2 dads were there when we came and stayed after we left. It was a wonderful gathering place, and Monique gave us awareness of things that Parks Canada did not. For instance, the ocean walk by her stop was not closed due to a storm, but because it was on sacred Indian burial area and out of the respect we should avoid it. It was on a sacred Indian burial. She told us where to camp without having to take a long trail to the official campground. She was blunt and almost machine-like, but something about her told me that under that harsh persona that she portrayed was even a meaner person deep inside. Sadly, Monique passed away a little while ago. I hope that it wasn't a knife fight, although that would be fitting. May she rest in peace. After a short hike, we were at kilometer 42 or mile 26, Cribbs Creek. A mirage of a comfortable, fulfilling meal was washed away often by the tide. Now my feet were raw, and it was only because I was too stupid to quit that I pushed on. Monique's Burger Shack was the closest thing to civilization we had seen for days. Day 5 is Wednesday. At some point in the hike, I felt a strange mystic sensation. I had the same feeling over the years in Jerusalem, Auschwitz, and the Claddagh Inn in Newfoundland, which was an old nunnery. Upon returning home, I researched what events could have ever happened near where I had felt these sensations. It turned out that facing the 100-foot cliffs along the coast was a shipwreck back in January 22, 1906, which took 136 lives plus an abundance of children who weren't included in the passenger list. Over the years, I've accepted that we feel things that we can't explain, but it doesn't mean that the feelings don't have significance to real events. It was obvious that our Bible, Blisters and Bliss, starting 3 to 4 hour hikes, was written before the boardwalks deteriorated to a point where many times they were becoming more of a hindrance that we wished weren't there as we scooted alongside the walks to avoid injury. On a 9-hour day, I asked some young 20-year-olds how long it took them to do the same trek as we had just done. They said it took them 7 hours. On the first 3 days, I was going 1 kilometer or 0.6 of a mile for much of the time. I was able to get up to 2 kilometers an hour or 1.25 miles after and 3 kilometers or 2 miles per hour after a half hour period. Besides my age, my skin continued to rip off both heels and my toes became more swollen and pussy. Often as I stared at what was ahead of my feet, I would remind myself to take one step at a time to keep myself moving. The camping enjoyment that Ryan and I were missing was due to my slow pace. Viewing our surroundings for me was taken up by Chevy Chase moments of 2 nods and move on. Even evening socializing was limited for me due to exhaustion. I knew that I didn't belong here, but the end was soon coming. At one rocky hill, I climbed up, had a rest, and started to walk down. Ryan asked me what I was doing, and I said that I was continuing our journey. He told me that I was going back. At that point, I realized that I was on the brink of losing it. We hiked for 9 kilometers, or 5.6 miles, to Nitinat Narrows, where salmon and crabs were waiting. By now, the rain had started, and it wasn't nice. We only had 3 kilometers, or 2 miles, to go to Sawakwa Point, where comfort tents were available. With a radio connection from Nitinat to our destination, confirming that we had the last tent was established and booked under Ken. My big worry was that there was more than one Ken. We were looking forward to showers, a toasty warm wood stove, to our tent with a laundry. We would ask more who could ask more for a comfort stop. It took Ryan and I 1/10 of a second to decide to pay $90 for a comfort tent or pay nothing to pitch a tent in the pouring rain. We had a beautiful view of the harsh Pacific and the rain. Oh, the rain. We settled down to a lovely seafood feast brought right out of the water where we ate. Quickly, the maitre d' noticed that I was using a plastic fork to dig out the meat of my share of crab, and quickly showed me how to use nature's fork, the crab's claw. It worked like a charm. Then he scolded both of us for mixing our salmon and potato butter with our plates of crab because they throw the crabs back into the water, much to the delight of the many waiting fish who clean out every orifice. Having been humbled by my lack of manners, our maitre d' then changed hats and was soon emptying garbage pails and plastic containers to take to the mainland. He was also the captain of the boat that would take us across the river to continue our journey. When he returned, he would sweep the floor to our open to the water shelter before leaving with the trekkers who chose to quit the trail early. On the floor was an old golden lab, a big dog with an easy demur. He became the cook's 4-year-old son's target for aggressive play, such as punching the dog in the snout, yanking on his tails, and wrapping himself around the dog. As all of us witnessed this mistreatment, it became obvious that this is the way it was as none of the locals intervened. The dog had no problem accepting this treatment, while we, the guests, thought that it was awful. It was hard to understand, but that's the way it was. I had a chance to talk to those who were leaving the trail. Carl Jacobson, the Dane, had been invited by his son to join him on the West Coast Trail. Coming from the north starting point at Bamfield, he had started at the easier end, and yet he chose not to continue. Some people choose to dig in and suffer through a challenge, while others are smart. Carl was smart. Before they returned to Denmark, they would visit Vancouver. There was a young man who had done the journey prior, but had bought what he thought were waterproof boots. His first mud hole flooded his feet, and he knew it would be impossible to carry on. So leaving the trail is what he did at the first evacuation point. An interesting couple that pulled the plug had a very scientific and rational thought process. First of all, she was given insight into the trek by her boss who had completed it earlier. They trained and prepared with all aspects of the trip accounted for. Volunteering to expand on her reasons for leaving the trail with her husband, she explained that she is one of those people with a protective gene. She knows by instinct when it is not safe to continue. Already, her husband had a board from the boardwalk break when he stepped on it. I didn't tell her about the 20 or so falls that I'd taken, the pointy branch that pierced my forehead, the ladder rung that was shaking loose in my hand 50 feet high on a less than safe ladder. I did say I thought that people exist on a scale from extremely cautious through adventurous and beyond to reckless. Her husband would have continued, but she was afraid for both of them. I felt sorry for him. Purple bear scat was seen with lots of tracks every day. Cougars we didn't see. It was time to leave the warmth of the fire, and with less than 3 kilometers or 2 miles to go on a full stomach, what could go wrong? In the pouring rain, minutes after leaving the shelter, we came upon a 12-foot mud cliff with ropes on 2 sides of the trail, which had become an open mud pit, perhaps 20 feet wide. Now I understood why Carl would leave. If this was the easy part, what else could be ahead? Plenty. It was now dark and rain continued. On several days, I was so exhausted by the end of the day to the point where Ryan took charge of setting up the camp, sometimes entirely on his own. I would set up my tent, slip into my sleeping bag, and shiver until I could warm up. In the rain, trekking through rough terrain to get to... So anyways, it was dark, the rain continued. I could set up my tent, slip into my sleeping bag, and shiver until I could get warm. In the rain, and trekking through rough terrain to get to Sequadra and the comfort tents made me more exhausted than ever. Ryan found the manager who told us we had the last tent on the beach. It was a hike down to the beach, across a creek, up some rocks, and a climb up into the deck where rain was accumulating on the tarp over the deck to the point of bursting. We walked into the blackened refuge and used our headlamps as the only source of light. I took my boots off because my worsened feet condition had walked around in Ryan's flip-flops as I had lost my flip-flops on day 2. Memo to self. Idiot. Ryan opened up the firebox only to find it full of water. Later, the manager said, "Oh yeah, that one needs an elbow." The thought did occur, so why didn't you get one? Oh, never mind. With gallant effort, Ryan tried to ignite the fire after using his food bowl to bail the water. I had gotten into my sleeping bag and began my now frequent evening ritual of shivering. With some tea, I was soon asleep. The showers and laundry were only figments of my desire to gain some semblance of comfort from this journey that was wearing me down. We slept, and in the morning I found an axe in a shed to split some wood into kindling, and we ended up with a nice fire, and we were able to dry off some of our clothes. What did the maroon sailors do without these walkways? Many died of hypothermia. Day 6, Thursday. We were soon onto our next target at kilometer 17 or mile 10 and a half. Sowis Creek was the closest camp to where we were, 13 kilometers or 8 miles away. This would mean we would have to trek roughly the same distance of 17 kilometers or 10 and a half miles on our last day. The rain had stopped, although it was misty and cloudy outside. This was good as it allowed us to stay hydrated. Compared to the South Trail, the North Trail water was more colored. One of the camps was an orange juice creek, for example. Klanawa River translates into pieces of blubber on the beach. I used 2 lemon-flavored electrolyte additives to my water because I was sweating a lot on the trip, and the creeks were our only source of water. I easily went through 2 1-liter bottles in a typical day. We had lost connection with the other trekkers after our comfort stop, except for the fellows who came early and stayed late at the crab shack. One of the dads who had done the trail earlier told me that we had 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles of beach for starters that day, but it is in deep gravel. He said, "The good news never stops, does it?" What was noticeable about all the trekkers that hiked the whole trail was that they always began conversations with a smile and always with enthusiasm. Even difficult areas of the trail were spoken of with pleasant memories and feelings of accomplishment. I was not the only one that had never done the trail and would never do the trail again, as I talked to those that wouldn't. And it was typically because they were getting long in the tooth. Their ability to do this demanding trek was based on their future physical abilities as they got older. It was not a hike for people with bad knees, hips, or poor stamina. We got to camp only to find that we were the only ones there. With a unique high gravel barrier in front of the Pacific Ocean and a waterfall close by, our final camp on the trail provided us with a rare experience of isolated tranquility. We had a shelter built by a previous hiker made of driftwood, where Ryan built a wonderful warm fire. Here we put wet clothes. Determined to get my socks dry, I put them too close to the fire and managed to burn holes in them. We were getting down on food, and one of us had to eat the chili macaroni. Having a poor track record for gastro control, Ryan gallantly volunteered to eat it instead of myself, in the unlikely possibility that I may have had an undesirable effect from this gassy meal. Day 7, the final 17 kilometers to the Panchena access, and our trek wasn't difficult when measured against the West Coast Trail standards, but it wasn't easy either. On the trek, we went off a side trail towards the sound of sea lions. Here we saw many sea lions on a large rock surface, and a young man approaching them from the far side of the rock. While you could see a couple of males lifting their heads and facing square towards the intruder, most of the animals just jumped into the water. When we observed how he got down, we could see that the only way he could have climbed was to climb down some very steep rock, but he had to jump over a crevice with another 50-foot drop into the ocean. When I asked the 4 friends who the brave one was, they said he isn't brave, he's crazy. He was from Poland and was traveling with good friends, 2 from Canada, 1 from the United States, and 1 from Australia. They went to university together and had maintained their friendship over the years. The Pole then asked me if they should take their packs off when they climbed the ladders, which told me that they may not be as prepared for the trek as they should be. Don't take off your pack. We made it to the Parks Canada office outside the town of Bamfield, but they were closed. We had a 1 kilometer, 0.6 mile walk through the RV park to reach the front office. Ryan went ahead and someone took pity on this disheveled piece of humanity stumbling down the road and gave me a ride. Bums would cross the road to avoid making contact with me. Having poor insight into weather forecasts, the fact that it hadn't rained all day, what were the chances that it would rain that night? In my typical exhausted condition, rather than find the spikes for my fly, I took a chance and lay the fly over the tent. That night, Ryan threw a tarp over my tent as I continued snoring while rain dripped into my into me, filling my mouth with water that created a fountain when I breathed out. I was past done. Saturday, we took a 4.5-hour bus ride back to Port Renfrew on logging roads. In the backwoods, loggers showed no regard for the land that they had reaped the wood harvest from. I felt that no company or individual has a right to harvest a crop on Crown land without reseeding that for future generations. I thought that the land stewards should be the indigenous people living in the area who could sow diverse trees. In a rainforest, I would think many types of trees would grow, and to leave scars in the terrain should be against the law. Each piece of reseeded forest would be worth thousands of dollars to the next generation. Continuing this process would bring in a steady income flow for the locals, with little chance of forest fire due to the wetness of the area. In addition, the locals should be responsible for the upkeep of the trails, seeing that the federal government hasn't maintained this trail for years. This too could be an income source for the locals. Sadly, because of a treaty that took 23 years to agree to, federal, provincial, the Ditati, and the Pachtita First Nations all have a stake in the park. It seems to me that no one is in charge, which is probably why the trail is in disrepair. Having removed my boots the previous night, I wore Ryan's flip-flops the rest of the trip, and the healing began. The journey was not yet over until we finally got back to Kelowna, and I was able to hug my family, kiss my wife, and put my wedding ring back on. Waiting for the bus at the village of Bamfield was an interesting experience as people just beginning to hike looked at the damage to my feet. Pictures were taken, and people would gawk in disbelief. One of the new hikers leaned over the log he was sitting on and got sick to his stomach. No one knew how bad my feet were until we had completed the trail. One thing that I detest more than pain is whining, so I kept the damage to myself. When I saw the doctor in Kelowna, he asked me if I hiked much. I said no. He said, I didn't think so. Smart ass. The challenge of the West Coast Trail provides an individual with the opportunity to test their abilities to respond to adversities and discomfort. Surviving over long periods of time requires planning and determination. Had we required to get our own food, we would have taken weeks to do the trail because catching fish, collecting berries would have been a good part of our day. Any young person would benefit from this journey, and when it is done, they will feel accomplished for doing it and will experience a new confidence in themselves. Niece Colleen did it in her 20s, and cousin Jim and his son did it in his 40s, and it was no big deal. How long it takes isn't as important as finishing it. I missed much of the beauty and sensational landscape due to my slowness. Others would gain even more satisfaction from the same journey by observing more. My neighbor's dad broke his ankle and had to be airlifted out. Much can happen. The reason for the trek was to have time with my son. Nothing can mean more about this hike than to be part of a survival journey where I witnessed the kind of take-charge person that my son had become. He was resourceful, strong, and perceptive in knowing how much his old man could take. Ryan deserves another opportunity to visit this trail, only with people his own age. The downtown at camp should have been more of the experience, and the stops along the way should have been more frequent. If Ryan again were to want to go to the trail and he were to ask me to join him, I would naturally say, forget about it. Our kids and grandkids should experience it, but it is now a fond memory that I will cherish, not because I did it, but because I did it with my son.